Welcome to Headline Wednesday from Dispatch U.S. Military History Magazine, developed by trackpads.com.
Today, we go to northern Afghanistan in the opening campaign after September 11, 2001, for the story of Operational Detachment Alpha, ODA 595, on horseback with the Northern Alliance. A longer print edition with fact sheets and photos is available on LinkedIn or by email.
The horses move in single file along a narrow ridge, their hooves knocking loose stones into the darkness below. In the saddles sit Special Forces operators from ODA 595, a 12-man detachment riding borrowed ponies through the broken hills of northern Afghanistan in October 2001. Their saddlebags carry satellite radios, laser designators, and extra batteries instead of sabers or lances. Somewhere above the jagged skyline, heavy bombers orbit unseen in the cold night air. On the plains beyond, Taliban armor waits, not yet aware that Americans and Northern Alliance fighters are watching. The air smells of dust, sweat, and burned diesel drifting from enemy positions. Every breath feels sharp at altitude, and every shift in the saddle reminds the Americans that these are rugged mountain horses, not trained cavalry mounts. Afghan commanders ride beside them, men who know the valleys and ridges through years of civil war. Short phrases pass through interpreters, mixing English, Dari, radio brevity, and hand gestures. Nearby, Taliban positions ring key towns with tanks, artillery, and troops. In a rocky depression, one team member checks a map under a red-lensed light. Another adjusts a satellite radio to catch a clean signal through the mountains. A third checks a laser designator that can mark targets the enemy cannot see. One wrong coordinate or misread ridgeline could send bombs onto the wrong lights. This is only one patrol in a campaign that has barely begun. But the mix of saddles and satellites already shows something new taking shape. The stakes reach far beyond one valley. It is October 2001, only weeks after the attacks of September 11th, and the Taliban still controls most of Afghanistan's cities and highways. Those cities shelter training camps, safe houses, and leadership circles tied to the network behind the attacks. The mission for these special forces teams is not merely to survive in hostile country. They are there to help local anti-Taliban forces seize ground, topple a government, and end the idea that Afghanistan can remain a safe haven for global terror planners. In northern Afghanistan, that means partnering with the Northern Alliance, a loose coalition that has fought the Taliban for years. Leaders such as Abdul Rashid Dostum bring local intelligence, cavalry-style maneuver, and fighters who know every pass, village, and culvert. What they have lacked is the ability to destroy Taliban armor, artillery, and bunkers from the sky. The 12-man American teams bring radios, targeting skills, and access to bombers and strike aircraft. When that link works, Afghan fighters on horseback can suddenly punch far above their weight. Failure would carry heavy costs. If the Northern Alliance collapsed or the first raids failed, the Taliban could consolidate, dig in, and force a larger and longer ground campaign. The United States would lose the chance to show that it could respond quickly with a light footprint and local partners. Afghan commanders and village leaders were watching to see which side had momentum. So were observers abroad, asking whether American technology and elite units could turn into results on difficult terrain. The story began far from the ridgelines, in the days after September 11th, when American leaders faced a grim map. Afghanistan was landlocked, ruled by the Taliban, hostile to Western forces, and already known as unforgiving ground for foreign armies. Instead of opening with a massive conventional invasion, the United States chose to send small special forces detachments and intelligence teams to work with Afghan factions already fighting the regime. For the 5th Special Forces Group, years of regional study and language training suddenly moved from preparation to mission. By mid-October,
The air campaign over Afghanistan was already striking training camps, air defenses, and Taliban positions. Airstrikes alone, however, could not seize Mazar-e-Sharif, Kabul, or the road networks that held the regime together. The missing link was someone on the ground who could talk with Afghan leaders, understand the local fight, and put bombs where they mattered. That meant loading small teams into helicopters, flying them over high mountains at night, and inserting them into rough landing zones where the enemy still held heavy weapons.
ODA 595 stepped into thin air, rocky soil, and a political landscape shaped by rivalries older than their uniforms. Their first meetings with Northern Alliance commanders were about trust as much as tactics. The Americans brought satellite radios, imagery, and access to long-range bombers. The Afghans brought fighters, local knowledge, and years of hard-earned understanding about where Taliban tanks were dug in, which villages might help, and which passes could become traps.
Plans were made over tea and maps, with interpreters carefully turning promises and warnings into shared understanding. The terrain and limited road network made trucks scarce and vulnerable. Horses were available, durable, and central to how Afghan commanders moved. If the Americans wanted to see the front and stay with their partners, they had to trade Humvees for saddles and accept that the next objective might be reached by a goat track along a cliff.
Once the partnerships formed, the fight began changing day by day. Taliban forces still held ridgelines and valley mouths, with tanks, armored personnel carriers, and artillery captured in earlier wars. From those positions, they could shell villages, block advances, and threaten any move toward major cities. To change that, the Americans had to see the strong points close enough to target them, which meant miting with Afghan fighters across broken ground under intermittent fire.
Contact often began with Taliban artillery or rockets sending dust and shrapnel through advancing horsemen. Afghan riders fanned out or dropped behind shallow cover, while the Green Berets searched for vantage points where they could see the enemy and the friendlies. One accurate grid coordinate, relayed by satellite radio and confirmed with a laser mark when possible, could bring a bomber onto a tank, gun line, or trench. Minutes later, bombs turned positions that had dominated local battles for years into smoking craters.
The psychological effect mattered as much as the physical destruction. Afghan fighters saw enemy armor that had once controlled the battlefield disappear in a single strike. Skeptical commanders and nervous villagers began to believe this new partnership could break the stalemate. Taliban forces saw the opposite lesson. Vehicles and gun positions that had once meant strength now drew attention from aircraft overhead.
The advances rarely looked neat on a map. Some days brought only a few ridges taken or the edge of a town reached before nightfall. Other days, well-timed strikes and coordinated assaults opened ground that had been impossible to cross a week earlier. Afghan cavalry-style movements, supported by air power, rolled over positions that had seemed secure. Hooves, small arms, radios, and distant aircraft became part of the same fight. As roads and passes fell to the Northern Alliance, Taliban garrisons came under mounting pressure. Supply routes grew fragile, morale cracked. Local commanders weighed whether to remain loyal, bargain, fall back, or disappear before the next bombardment. Radios that had first called in single strikes now helped coordinate broader offensives, linking scattered Afghan formations into something closer to a coherent push. What made the difference was not one cavalry charge or one perfect bomb. It was the combination of several advantages at once. American teams saw the battlefield through optics, satellite imagery, aircraft, and local reports. Afghan commanders added knowledge of defiles, riverbeds, village loyalties, and mountain routes that mattered more than any printed map. When those views aligned, Taliban's strongpoints became exposed targets. Momentum became a weapon. Early successes had to be earned one strike at a time, but each destroyed position changed perceptions.
Taliban commanders who had trusted tanks and artillery as anchors now saw them as liabilities. Northern Alliance fighters who had been stalled for years watched old roadblocks crack. Confidence shifted from one side to the other, and that shift began changing the political landscape as much as the military one. Leadership decisions kept the link alive. Afghan commanders had to move quickly when gaps opened, accepting the risk of advancing under fire. American detachment leaders had to ride far enough forward to guide air power accurately while staying alive and maintaining communications. Again and again, they chose to move with their partners so the connection between horsemen and bombers would not break. On the Taliban side, massing forces around strongpoints made sense in older fights, but became dangerous once precision strikes could reach them. The results showed on the map with surprising speed. As Taliban positions crumbled in the north, Mazar-e-Sharif fell into Northern Alliance hands, opening major routes and shaking the regime's hold. The loss triggered defections, retreats, and hurried attempts to regroup farther south and east. Within weeks, Kabul slipped from Taliban control as fighters abandoned checkpoints and government buildings rather than face advancing ground forces and continued airstrikes.
What began with small special forces teams and scattered Afghan allies ended with the Taliban's first regime pushed out of Afghanistan's major cities. The Northern Campaign became a case study in how a small American footprint, local partners, and powerful air support could achieve rapid results. Military planners studied how quickly armor and fixed defenses could be neutralized when observers on the ground had the right tools and the right relationships.
The image of Americans on horseback calling in strikes remains powerful because it captures old and new war colliding. Leather saddles moved with satellite radios. Tribal alliances intersected with global politics. Local knowledge guided distant aircraft. Horses carried men who could summon precision weapons from the sky. It was not the technology alone that mattered, but the people close enough to use it well. The long years of conflict that followed showed how incomplete an initial military success can be when deeper political and social problems remain unresolved. Front lines moved again, new enemies emerged, and many of the same valleys saw more fighting. Still, the opening weeks matter for what they accomplished and for the questions they raised about partners, light footprints, air power, and political outcomes. When we look back at ODA 595 and their Afghan partners riding toward enemy lines, we see more than a dramatic image. We see a reminder that even the most advanced tools depend on small groups willing to move forward into cold, dust, and uncertainty. Technology can extend reach, but people still have to read the ground, build trust, take risks, and decide where to place the next mark on the map.